Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip is one that we are revisiting. I think it's been quite a few years actually since I have done a video on this concept, but today's tip is on the time limit of an offer or a counter offer, and I just wanted to go over that with you. So when you are an agent representing a buyer and you're writing an offer, or when you are a listing agent and you are receiving an offer, on both the GAR contract form and the RE forms contract form, you will see a place to insert a time limit of that offer. And it has a fill in the blank for a time, an actual clock time, AM, PM, and then a date. And this is true of an offer, or it is also on the counter offer forms. So the issue is, what does the time limit mean when it is written on an offer or a counter offer? Many agents mistakenly think that it means that that is the time frame that they need to hear back or get a response from the other side, or even hear back from the agent that the agent has received the offer. That's not what it is at all. The time limit of an offer simply means that, well, let me read it to you what it says. So it is actually defined on the contracts, and if you guys have ever taken any of my contracts classes, you will repeatedly hear me say that the contract is nothing more than a set of instructions to all the parties, and that instruction or the definition of the time limit is on there. So on the GAR purchase and sale agreement, F201 GAR purchase and sale agreement, it is the fill in the blank to actually fill in the time limit is on the front page, but it is defined. It is defined under paragraph B11, time limit of offer, and it says the time limit of the offer shall be the date and time referenced herein. That was what you referenced, was what you filled in the blank on the front page, when the offer expires, unless prior to that date and time, both of the following have occurred. A, the offer has been accepted by the party to whom the offer was made, and B, notice of that acceptance of the offer has been delivered to the party who made that offer. Now, in the RE forms contract, the time limit is spelled out right before the signature. It says the offer is open for acceptance until such and such o'clock, AM or PM, on whatever date. And acceptance after that time shall be considered a counteroffer. And on the counteroffer form, it is also on there on the GAR. It's also on the RE, but on the GAR it says this counteroffer, which incorporates and controls over the original offer, shall expire at blank o'clock, AM or PM, on the date of, unless prior to that time it is accepted in writing and notice, as that term's defined in the original offer, is delivered to the party who made the last offer or counteroffer. So what does all this mean? Well, basically what this means is that this offer, the terms that, let's just talk about an offer. It would be the same for a counteroffer, but let's just talk about it in terms of an original offer from a buyer. The terms that the buyer writes in that initial offer, those terms are open for acceptance until whatever, 6 o'clock 3 days from now, or whatever the time limit is. That means, so those terms are open for acceptance. So if the seller doesn't accept those terms or doesn't accept all of those terms, what is the seller going to do? The seller is going to make a counter offer. So if the seller is making a counter offer, if the seller does not accept all the terms from the original offer, the seller doesn't accept the sale price, the seller doesn't accept the closing date, the seller doesn't accept the closing cost contribution, something, anything. If the seller is going to change anything from the original offer, then the seller is not accepting those terms. They're not accepting those terms as presented by the buyer. They're making their own offer back to the buyer, what we refer to as a counter offer. So since the seller is not accepting those terms, who cares about the time frame? In other words, a seller's counteroffer, the seller's going to make a counteroffer to a buyer's original offer. The counteroffer can be whenever. It does not have to be prior to the expiration of the time limit on the offer. The time limit on the offer means that the buyer is saying, look, I'll buy your house with these specific terms, but this is only good until whatever, 6 o'clock 2 days from now. If you don't accept it as is, as I have presented, prior to the expiration of that time limit, and accepted by signing it and giving notice of acceptance, sending it back to me before the expiration of that time limit, we don't have a deal. That's what a time limit is. It is only a time frame under which a seller must accept it without change and give notice of that acceptance back to the buyer. So again, if the seller doesn't accept those terms, it's going to make a change to the terms. A seller can make a counteroffer at any time. A seller can make a counteroffer prior to the expiration of the time limit. A seller may make a counteroffer hours after the expiration of the time limit. Seller can make a counteroffer 3 days after the expiration of the time limit. It doesn't matter. The seller's counteroffer back to the buyer constitutes a whole new offer. It's just that the party initiating the offer is the seller initiating it back to the buyer. And the seller can put a time frame on the counteroffer back to the buyer. So again, as far as counters go, and then the same thing, my example, I'm using the word seller and buyer just for illustrative purposes, but it is the same concept. If a seller makes a counteroffer back to a buyer on a counteroffer form and puts a time limit on there, that means the buyer must accept the seller's terms prior to the expiration of that counteroffer, the time limit on that counteroffer, with signing in writing and sending notice of that acceptance back, in this situation for a counteroffer, back to the seller before the expiration of the time limit. But same thing, if the buyer doesn't accept the terms from that seller, then the buyer can make another counteroffer whenever, at any time frame. So now let's switch gears just a little bit and let's talk about what happens if let's go back to the initial scenario. Let's say a buyer writes an offer to a seller, has a time limit on there, and let's say the seller loves the offer, does not want to change anything, but does not sign it and send it back to the buyer until after the expiration of the time limit. Do you have a binding contract? The answer is no. Those terms were not open for acceptance after the time limit. So again, let's just say the time limit was 6 p.m., 3 days from the offer date. Let's say 3 days from the offer date, for whatever reason for the delay, the seller decides they do want to take that offer, they like it, but they don't sign it and they don't send it back. Remember, there's two things. They have to sign it and they have to give notice of acceptance back to the person that made the offer. So let's say in this example, the seller doesn't sign it and send it back to the buyer until 8 p.m., 3 days from the date of the offer. So the time limit expired at 6 p.m. The seller signed it and sent it back, but that wasn't until 8 p.m. Do you have a binding contract? No, you don't. What do you have? You now have a counter offer because it is the same terms. In essence, it would be the same as the seller initiating a counter offer back to the buyer that has the same terms. And I know it gets a little complicated, but that's what it is. Contractually, it is now a counter offer. So in other words, it is not so now what has to happen is now the buyer must sign it prior. Really, there should be there's no time limit on this. So now the buyer has to sign it and send it back to the seller, and the seller binds it. Because remember, the definition of a binding contract is, I'll read you that definition. The definition of a binding contract is the binding agreement date shall be the date when the party to this transaction who has accepted an offer or counteroffer to buy real estate delivers notice of that acceptance to the party who made the offer or counteroffer in accordance with the notice section. An easier way to understand it is that a binding agreement is with the receiver of the offer accepts it as presented without modification, communicated in writing. Basically, I thought it was in writing somewhere, but basically the easiest way to think about it is the person that binds a contract is the party that makes the last offer or counteroffer. So regardless if it's the buyer to the seller or the seller back to the buyer or back and forth, the party making the last offer or counteroffer. So let's say we've been going back and forth, I'm the seller, I make a counteroffer back to the buyer. The buyer signs it and accepts it, but I still don't have notice of acceptance. I don't know if I'm receiving back another counteroffer or a completely signed accepted contract. So I was the party making the last offer. I sent it to, in this example, the buyer signs it, but I have no notice of that. Once the buyer sends notice of acceptance back to me, I bind the contract. So the party making the last offer or counteroffer is the party that binds the contract. So backing up with respect to the time limit, again, it is a little confusing, but if a party accepts a contract after the time limit of the offer, it actually constitutes a counteroffer. And that is specifically spelled out, rightfully so, in the RE contract form. It says the offer is open for acceptance until blank o'clock on whatever date. An acceptance after that time frame shall be considered a counteroffer, and you just have to go one more round for signatures. Now, do you need a time limit of an offer? The answer is no. You don't need to put a time limit on an offer or a counteroffer. However, if you have an open offer or counteroffer out there without a time limit and the party that you represent changes their mind, remember you must withdraw that last offer or counteroffer, and you would have to use the withdrawal forms. There's one available in GAR and in the RE contract forms. And you're going to, in writing with the party that you represent, signing it with their signature, withdraw that last offer or counteroffer before you get notice of acceptance of that. Another time frame, or what should you put for a time frame for a time limit of an offer? Well, that depends. It depends on if you are a buyer, if you know the seller is a corporate seller, a bank, so forth and so on, or there are multiple offers, you might want to put a long time limit on there, because what you don't want to set up is you don't want to set up for that buyer a situation where they're writing an offer that the seller could accept, but you put too brief of a time limit on there and the seller isn't able to get to it or to accept it until after that time frame. So in those situations, you're going to want to put a long time limit on there, if one at all. If you are a seller and you're writing a counter offer back to a buyer and you hear that you might be getting another offer, or you have multiple offers but you want to deal with one at a time, you might put a very brief time limit on there. So again, the circumstances dictate what timing you are going to put for a time limit of an offer. But the biggest thing to understand is if a party is going to make a counter offer, then the time limit is of no consequence, because it's a whole new offer to be considered between the buyer and the seller, just depending on which party initiated it. Whew. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.